Imagine standing at the foot of the world's deadliest mountain, where the air is so thin it feels like your lungs are being crushed and every single mistake can cost you your life. Mount Everest doesn't care who you are, how much money you have, or how important you think you are. It simply punishes arrogance in the most brutal way imaginable. Today, we're diving deep into the shocking, jaw-dropping true stories of 5 so-called Karens who thought they could conquer Everest on their own terms. These are the tales of highly educated, successful professionals who ignored every warning, dismissed expert advice, and paid the ultimate price in the most terrifying ways possible. From a doctor who believed her medical degree made her smarter than the mountain itself, to an attorney who thought her weekend hikes qualified her for the death zone. These stories will leave you speechless, angry, and absolutely stunned at how quickly hubris can turn into tragedy on the roof of the world. It all began on April 19, 2015, in the Khumbu region of Nepal. Base camp sat at a staggering 17,600 feet on the frozen Khumbu Glacier. A sprawling sea of colorful tents scattered across the ice like colorful dots on a deadly chessboard. The afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the glacier as climbers moved between camps, checking gear and preparing for the brutal days ahead. Among them was Dr. Bonnie Baxter, a 47-year-old emergency room physician who had joined a commercial expedition of 12 climbers. She had completed 3 high-altitude treks before, but Everest was her very first technical climb above 24,000 feet. From the moment she arrived, Dr. Baxter made sure everyone knew about her medical background. During the very first safety briefing, she interrupted the lead guide multiple times, confidently suggesting alternative ways to manage altitude sickness because, in her mind, her medical training gave her superior insight. When the team began their acclimatization rotations, she openly questioned the oxygen flow rates recommended by the expedition outfitter. She even adjusted her own regulator settings based on personal calculations, insisting that her years as a doctor made her judgment far better than anyone else's on the mountain. At Camp 2, Dr. Baxter went a step further. Feeling ill, she purchased an extra oxygen canister from another climber and stored all 3 bottles inside her personal tent without bothering to register the additional bottle with the expedition's official inventory. When her tent partner, Margaret Rosen, started showing clear signs of altitude sickness and desperately asked if Baxter had any spare oxygen, the doctor coldly refused. She told Rosen she needed every single bottle for her own summit attempt. The expedition leader had to arrange emergency oxygen from the reserve stock so Rosen could descend safely with a Sherpa. Baxter simply remarked that Rosen had not prepared adequately for the mountain, and that was why she was struggling. Rosen eventually recovered at base camp over 2 days and rejoined the team at Camp 4 after a scheduled rest day, cleared by the expedition medic. Before the final summit push, the expedition leader conducted a mandatory equipment check at Camp 4. When he inspected Baxter's 3rd oxygen bottle, he immediately noticed visible wear on one of the regulator valves and strongly recommended she leave it behind for safety. Dr. Baxter refused outright. She declared that her medical background qualified her to evaluate the equipment herself and insisted the bottle belonged to her, so she would take it no matter what. The team left Camp 4 at 11 p.m. Baxter was carrying 3 full oxygen canisters strapped to her pack, roughly 8 pounds heavier than what every other climber was carrying. At 27,500 feet, Margaret Rosen began struggling badly with her breathing and had to descend with a Sherpa. At 28,200 feet, just 700 feet below the summit, Dr. Baxter started falling behind as well. She stopped 3 times within a 20-minute span. The lead guide assigned a Sherpa to stay with her and continued upward with the rest of the clients. At 6:40 a.m., while the Sherpa was briefly helping another climber, Dr. Baxter unclipped herself from the fixed rope and wandered laterally across a dangerous 40-degree snow slope. A descending climber spotted her about 60 feet off the established route, moving slowly and without any clear direction. He tried to get her attention but couldn't. She kept traversing until the slope became nearly vertical rock, then simply sat down in the snow with her oxygen mask hanging loose around her neck. When the descending climber finally reached her, 2 of her 3 bottles were already empty. The 3rd, still full, had rolled 10 feet down the slope and lodged against a rock. One of the empty regulators showed a clear crack at the connection valve, exactly the same valve the expedition leader had warned her about earlier. The climber retrieved the full bottle and tried to connect it to her mask, but Baxter didn't respond to words or touch. Her eyes were open but completely unfocused. He radioed the situation at 7:10 a.m. The lead guide was already at the summit and couldn't descend immediately because of heavy traffic on the fixed lines. The descending climber stayed with her for 20 agonizing minutes, desperately trying to administer oxygen and warm her freezing hands. Her breathing grew irregular and shallow. At 7:35 a.m., she slumped forward. He checked for a pulse and found none. With his own oxygen running low, he marked the GPS location and continued his descent. A recovery team reached her body the next morning. Dr. Bonnie Baxter was still sitting in the exact same position, 65 feet from the fixed line, the full oxygen bottle still lodged against the rock where it had rolled. The official investigation ruled her death as severe hypoxia leading to high-altitude cerebral edema. The faulty valve she had ignored, combined with her self-adjusted flow rates, had caused her oxygen to run out far too quickly. By the time she tried to switch bottles, cognitive impairment had already taken over. Her wandering off route and inability to reach the full bottle right beside her were classic signs of late-stage cerebral edema. It took a specialized recovery team 6 full days to bring her body down the mountain. Now let's move to May 11, 2016, on the southern route of Mount Everest. The campsite was a bustling village of dozens of tents clustered by expedition groups, connected by narrow paths stamped into the snow. Climbers moved between tents in the late afternoon, checking gear and resting before the next brutal rotation. Jolene Harwood, a 41-year-old real estate developer, had paid for a guided expedition. She had only completed a single mountaineering course in Colorado 6 months earlier. She arrived in Nepal with cheap climbing gear she had bought online, a harness, carabiners, and ascenders that cost about 40% less than the professional equipment sold by the expedition outfitter. When other climbers asked about her gear during the trek to base camp, Harwood proudly told them she had done extensive research and found equivalent quality at better prices. During the mandatory gear inspection at base camp, the lead guide immediately flagged her harness. It was a recreational sport climbing model designed for gym use and single-pitch routes, not for multi-week expeditions on Everest. The belay loop was thinner than mountaineering standards, and the stitching was much lighter weight. The guide strongly recommended she buy a proper replacement for $280. Harwood refused. She pointed to the UIAA safety certification label and accused the guide of trying to upsell unnecessary equipment. Over the next 2 weeks, her harness began showing obvious wear. The belay loop stitching started fraying where it connected to the waist belt. Another climber pointed it out at Camp 1, and a Sherpa raised the same concern on the way to Camp 2. Both times, Harwood barely glanced at it, dismissed the warnings as normal abrasion, and insisted she could recognize genuinely damaged equipment herself. She never reported the fraying to the guides or asked for a replacement. On May 10th, the team moved to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet in preparation for the summit push. During the final equipment check, the expedition leader examined her harness again. The fraying had become severe. Multiple strands of the belay loop were now visibly separated. He strongly urged her to use a backup harness from the emergency supply. Harwood refused once more, saying the harness had supported her weight the entire expedition and she didn't want to switch to unfamiliar gear at this stage. The summit team left Camp 4 at 10:45 p.m. on May 10th. Harwood climbed in the middle of the group, clipping and unclipping from the fixed rope as the route zigzagged up the southeast ridge. The temperature was minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit with 15-mile-per-hour winds. At 27,900 feet, they reached the notorious Hillary Step, a near-vertical 40-foot rock face. At 5:50 a.m., as the sky began to lighten, Harwood clipped her ascender to the rope and started climbing. Halfway up, about 18 feet above the slope below, she stopped to rest and leaned back, putting her full weight onto the harness. At 6:02 a.m., the belay loop suddenly tore completely free from the waist belt with a sharp ripping sound. Harwood dropped backward, still attached to the rope by her ascender but no longer connected to her body. She tumbled past the waiting climber and fell 200 feet down the exposed rock and ice face. Her body came to rest on a steep 55-degree snow slope. 2 guides reached her 30 minutes later. She was face down in the snow, unresponsive, with no pulse or breathing. Her helmet had been knocked off and lay 40 feet upslope. The separated harness was still clipped to the rope by the ascender. The belay loop had completely detached at the buckle after weeks of repeated loading. The investigation ruled her death as massive trauma from the fall, skull fractures, cervical spine damage, and severe internal injuries. The harness failure was directly caused by using recreational-grade equipment on a multi-week Everest expedition, something its certification was never designed for. She had been warned about the visible fraying on 4 separate occasions and refused to replace it every single time. Her body was recovered over 3 days and evacuated by helicopter from 26,500 feet. The case was officially ruled an accidental death resulting from equipment failure after repeated refusal to heed warnings. On May 20, 2014, in the infamous death zone above Camp 4, the South Col stretched flat and windswept at 26,000 feet, a barren, merciless expanse of rock and ice. Felicia Holt, 44, ran a yoga and wellness studio and was making her second attempt at Everest after turning back the previous year due to weather. She had practiced high-altitude breathing techniques for months and constantly told other climbers that her cardiovascular conditioning and pranayama exercises would compensate for her limited technical experience. On May 19th, the expedition leader gave a serious briefing about the narrow summit window and emphasized a strict 11 a.m. turnaround time. No exceptions. Holt openly questioned why their cutoff was earlier than other teams and asked if stronger climbers could push past it. The leader made it crystal clear. Everyone would descend at 11 a.m. without exception. That evening, Holt learned other expeditions were planning a 1 p.m. turnaround. She pressed her own guide about why their schedule was more conservative. Later, she was heard asking whether the guides would actually enforce the turnaround if someone was close to the summit. During the final equipment check at Camp 4, Holt asked if 1 oxygen bottle would be enough if she used her breathing techniques to reduce consumption. The leader firmly said 2 bottles were mandatory. She packed both, but privately told another climber she expected to use only 1. At 11:30 p.m., the team began the summit push. They reached the balcony at 4:20 a.m. Holt activated only 1 bottle at a reduced flow rate and left her second bottle cached there, telling her Sherpa she would retrieve it on the way down if needed. At 9:40 a.m., the team reached 28,700 feet on the final ridge. A massive traffic jam of about 30 climbers stretched ahead on the fixed rope. The guide calculated they could not reach the summit before 11 a.m. and ordered everyone to descend. Holt unclipped from the fixed line and refused to move. When the guide touched her shoulder and pointed downward, she turned away and started climbing upward anyway, stepping around other clipped-in climbers and disrupting the entire rope. By 11:15 a.m., she had gained 80 feet and merged into traffic from other expeditions. Her reduced flow rate had stretched her first bottle, but by 10:45 a.m. it was empty. She continued upward using only her breathing techniques, her pace slowing dramatically. At 12:10 p.m., she reached the summit, having climbed the final 130 feet without supplemental oxygen. She stayed at the top for 3 minutes before starting down. Traffic had worsened in both directions. By 1:30 p.m., she was at 28,600 feet, moving slowly and no longer clipping correctly. At 2:05 p.m., she sat down on the narrow ridge. Her oxygen mask hung loose over her face, still connected to the empty bottle. She fumbled with her pack, but couldn't manage the clips and didn't respond to climbers asking if she needed help. At 2:20 p.m., she slumped sideways, held in place only by her Jumar still attached to the rope. 3 nearby climbers tried to share oxygen with her. Her breathing was already shallow and irregular. It stopped completely at 2:45 p.m. The incoming storm hit that evening, and high winds the next day prevented any recovery above the south summit. Felicia Holt remained fixed to the rope at 28,600 feet, her second oxygen bottle still sitting unused over 1,100 feet below at the balcony. The investigation ruled her death as acute hypoxia compounded by exhaustion. She had cached her backup supply and ignored the turnaround time, leaving herself with no margin for the deadly traffic delays. Controlled breathing techniques offered zero protection in the death zone. Her body was not recovered until 6 weeks later. On May 3, 2017, on the standard southeast ridge route, Camp 3 clung precariously to the steep Lhotse face at 24,000 feet. Claudia Beverly, 49, was part of a commercial expedition and had paid for the premium package that included dedicated Sherpa support and customized services. She worked in wealth management and had only one previous high-altitude climb on Mount Kilimanjaro, which required no technical skills or oxygen. Beverly constantly reminded everyone that her premium fee entitled her to personalized attention and scheduling flexibility. During the 3-week acclimatization period, she demanded later departure times and extended breakfasts with specially prepared meals that required her personal Sherpa to cook separately. When the expedition leader explained that everyone ate the same meals at the same time for safety and efficiency, she pointed to the customized service clause in her package. The guides tried to accommodate her when possible, but it slowed the entire team. On the ascent from Camp 1 to Camp 2, she stopped 6 times for 10 to 15 minutes each, causing the group to arrive nearly 2 hours behind schedule. When the leader warned that extended delays could become dangerous during the summit push, Beverly insisted she was managing her energy correctly and understood her own limits better than anyone else. On May 2nd, the leader announced a weather window for May 4th with summit attempts leaving Camp 4 around midnight. He stressed that everyone had to maintain group pace for a safe descent before afternoon weather worsened. Beverly privately argued that her premium package entitled her to climb at her own pace with dedicated Sherpa support. The leader firmly said no exceptions were possible above Camp 4. On May 3rd, the team reached the South Col at 2:30 p.m. During the rest period, Beverly made multiple demands on her Sherpa for hand warmers, specific snacks, and adjustments to her oxygen setup. When the guide called for departure at 10:45 p.m., Beverly emerged 15 minutes late. The team finally left at 11:10 p.m., already behind schedule. Beverly climbed slowly from the very beginning, stopping frequently. They reached the balcony at 5:20 a.m., 50 minutes late. After a short rest, the group continued at 5:25 a.m. Beverly stood up 4 minutes later and followed. At 8:50 a.m., they reached 28,400 feet, with the summit only 600 feet above. The guide set a firm 11:30 a.m. turnaround. At 9:15 a.m., Beverly sat down on the fixed line despite instructions to keep moving. The guide helped her up after 3 minutes. The team summit at 10:45 a.m., Beverly spent 8 full minutes at the top posing for photos while her Sherpa took pictures. Everyone else had already started descending after 2 or 3 minutes. She began her descent at 10:55 a.m. Her pace slowed dramatically. The 300-foot stretch to the south summit took 75 minutes, with her stopping 6 times. By 1:40 p.m., they were at 27,800 feet. Winds were blowing at 30 miles per hour, and the temperature had dropped to minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Beverly sat down and could no longer continue under her own power. The guide ordered the Sherpas to short rope her. At 3:50 p.m., at 27,200 feet, she collapsed completely. 2 Sherpas managed to move her only 50 feet in 20 minutes before progress became impossible. With darkness less than 90 minutes away and the team still 1,200 feet above Camp 4, the guide set up an emergency bivouac at a small rock outcrop at 27,150 feet. At 5:10 p.m., Beverly became unresponsive. Wind gusts reached 45 miles per hour, and the temperature plunged to minus 30 degrees. Her breathing stopped at 5:45 p.m. The guide and Sherpas descended through total darkness using headlamps, reaching Camp 4 at 8:20 p.m. with serious frostbite injuries to their hands and feet. Beverly's body was recovered on May 8th when conditions finally improved. The investigation ruled her death as severe hypothermia and exhaustion. Her cumulative delays, roughly 2.5 hours beyond a normal ascent, had placed the entire team in an impossible situation as daylight and oxygen ran out together. The Sherpas and guide who stayed with her suffered serious frostbite as a direct result of the extra time spent above 27,000 feet trying to save her. Finally, on April 23, 2013, at Everest Base Camp, climbers moved between tents in the late morning while the deadly Khumbu icefall loomed above like a frozen monster. Rosalind Fletcher, 43, was a corporate attorney who had signed up for a commercial expedition after only a few weekend hiking trips in Colorado. On her application, she listed experience on 3 peaks above 14,000 feet and described herself as an experienced alpine hiker with basic technical skills. During the initial team meeting, when the leader asked specific questions about crampons, ice axes, and fixed rope systems, Fletcher gave vague general answers. On the first rotation through the Khumbu icefall, she struggled badly with ladder crossings over crevasses. She needed multiple attempts to clip and unclip her safety tethers and moved much slower than everyone else. Her crampon points caught on the ladder rungs twice, causing her to freeze in panic. When the guide asked about her mountaineering course, she said it had covered the basics and she just needed practice. On the second rotation to Camp 2, her technique was still poor. She frequently attached her ascender backwards or failed to lock the cam properly. Her crampon work on steep ice was inefficient, causing terrible arm fatigue. The leader recommended extra practice. Fletcher insisted she was improving and would be ready, reminding everyone how much money and time away from her law practice she had already invested. On May 15th, the team moved to Camp 3 at 24,000 feet for the final acclimatization rotation on the steep Lhotse face. Fletcher left Camp 2 at 6 a.m. Within hours, she had fallen 100 feet behind. By mid-morning, she had stopped twice to rest. Her pace slowed to only 50 feet every 15 minutes. At 12:30 p.m., at 23,400 feet, she began coughing violently. The guide recognized the early signs of high-altitude pulmonary edema and radioed for immediate descent. Fletcher refused. She said she had invested too much time and money to turn back during a training rotation. She stood up and kept climbing. By 2:15 p.m., her coughing had become terrifying. Pink, frothy sputum appeared at the corners of her mouth. The guide recognized full-blown pulmonary edema and called an emergency. Within minutes, Fletcher could no longer stand without support. Her breathing was wet and gurgling. The guide clipped a short tether between their harnesses and began lowering her down the fixed line. At 2:40 p.m., she lost consciousness. The guide continued the descent for 30 minutes against her dead weight on the steep face. 2 Sherpas ascending from Camp 2 reached them at 3:10 p.m. The 3 worked together to move her down, alternating between lowering and short roping. At 4:20 p.m., at 22,400 feet, 1 Sherpa checked for a pulse and found none. Her lips and face had turned blue. They continued carrying her body down to Camp 2, arriving exhausted at 6:50 p.m. A guide with wilderness medical training confirmed she had died from pulmonary edema. The investigation later revealed that Fletcher had only completed a weekend introductory course, not a full technical program. Her Colorado climbs were actually standard hiking trails that required no ropes or crampons. Her poor technique had forced her body to work 2 to 3 times harder than a skilled climber, triggering the fatal edema. Her refusal to descend when symptoms first appeared at 12:30 p.m. had eliminated the only window when descent could have saved her. These 5 stories are not just climbing accidents. They are brutal lessons in arrogance meeting the unforgiving power of the world's highest mountain. Everest doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about your degree, your money, your premium package, or your weekend hikes. When you ignore warnings, dismiss experts, and put your own ego above safety, the mountain will collect its price. And sometimes that price is the ultimate one. If these stories shocked you as much as they shocked me, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another jaw-dropping tale from the edge of human endurance. Thanks for watching. Stay safe out there, and never, ever underestimate the mountain.